we go. So we're recording this event so that those who weren't able to be here can listen at a later date, and so you can listen again if you wish. So thank you to everyone here who registered to attend, and to those who were able to offer us as a voluntary donation when you booked to help us fund our work with bereaved families. It's been a really challenging year for us all in the charity sector, so we're hugely grateful for any donation you've been able to make to attend tonight. Your support means the world to us, and it's now absolutely critical in helping us to continue to offer our unique peer-to-peer support, understanding, friendship and hope to others. You can donate at any time using the donate button on our website. So as I've said before at the last talk that we heard from Maria, no words can fix the tragedy of the loss of a child or a sibling. When I first contacted TCF, I willed the wonderful volunteers I spoke to please take away the acute and the overwhelming pain of my daughter's death. And now, almost 16 years later, when I speak with bereaved families, I still so wish TCF could somehow take away the raw and devastating pain of a child or sibling that has died far, far too soon. But I, and I guess all of you, know there's no magic wand or quick fix. And however much we want it all to go away, the pain of grief is something that not only unites us, but something that we together endure and somehow find a way through. My hope is that as you listen to Cathy tonight, you will hear one or two things that stay with you and will be help to you as you journey on somehow without your much loved son or daughter, or brother or sister. I hope you'll perhaps find through Cathy's words some helpful ways to live with the tragedy of your loved one who has died too soon. As many of you know, at our gatherings and retreats that we hold in normal times, we often invite a guest speaker. And if the pandemic hadn't hit, early next month, many of us would have been meeting together at one of our largest gatherings of bereaved parents, siblings and grandparents in Northamptonshire. Last year, Cathy had kindly accepted our invitation to be our special guest speaker at this upcoming gathering in Northants, but that is sadly not able to take place. However, we're absolutely delighted that Cathy agreed to talk to us via the medium of the internet instead, which is really wonderful as it means so many more of us can hear her words. Cathy, so now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Cathy Renson Brink to you all. Cathy was born in Cornwall. She grew up in Yorkshire. She's lived in London and is now back living in beautiful Cornwall, from where she's speaking to us tonight. Cathy works with words and is a prolific and extraordinary writer. Her latest book, Dear Reader, The Comfort and Joy of Books, was published just last month, and she regularly chairs literary events, interviews authors, reviews books, runs creative writing workshops, and speaks and writes on life, death, love, and literature. Cathy is also the author of the Sunday Times best-selling memoir, The Last Act of Love, an account of the life and death of her brother Mattie, of whom I'm sure we will hear a bit more about tonight. This book was shortlisted for the prestigious Wellcome Book Prize and selected for the Richard and Judy Book Club. Cathy's second book, the brilliant A Manual for Heartache, is literally a survival guide for hard times. In the book, Cathy takes a broad and incredibly honest look at how to live with sorrow, anguish, despair, and loss. It is, as Cathy describes in the book, a hopeful book about living with heartache. Since its publication in 2017, this book has brought huge comfort to anyone going through a painful time and has been described as big-hearted, moving, deeply sympathetic, and gently honest, a goldmine of wisdom and insight. And I absolutely agree with all of that. So a warm welcome to the Compassionate Friends, Cathy. We are truly delighted that you accepted our invitation to speak to us tonight. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And I'll hand over to you. We need to unmute you. There we go.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Yes, I would have been with many of you in real life next month. but I'm very glad to be here tonight. And what I will try to do when I do Zooms, when there should have been real life things, is I do try to imagine that actually I am with you in real life, that we are all together, that we would have the reassuring nature of real life eye contact. I love being in rooms with people. So I'll be imagining that we are together, because that will enable me to be more honest and more intimate and more friendly in the way that I think I would have felt. Everybody I've ever met from Compassionate Friends makes me feel that I too am being covered in this umbrella of loving support. And I'm sure that's how I would have felt in the room, and it's how I'm going to try to feel now to be with you tonight. I always feel very much with the subject of grief. I'm very much in the trenches, still in the trenches. My brother was knocked over when I was 17 and I'm now 47. So that is 30 years ago. So I would say grief is a long game. And it feels to me, I mean, it's a great honor to be here with all of you, because I know that you're in the trenches too. So if anything, I feel a sense of awe to be with you. And I hope that what I have to tell you might be useful. Certainly it's been a very big thing for me to be able to make something useful out of what happened. It's made me feel a little bit better. It's made my parents feel a little bit better. The other thing as well is, obviously I am a bereaved sibling. It was my brother that died, but I really felt in writing my first book that I was making a record of what had happened on behalf of my parents as well, because it wasn't something that either of them wanted to do. But there are times, I think, in that book where it does almost feel like a plural voice, where I'm trying to describe the experience of all of us. And I'll talk a bit about that a bit later as well, the way that the three of us, out of our original family of four, and there being three left, the different way that grief has taken us all, I think, from the same thing that happened, we've all responded to it quite differently. And underlining, if we ever need one, that the main thing about grief is that it is it's unique. Everybody's experiences are their own. I am, of course, very wary of offering, I hope I don't, of offering, platitudes or this will be the same for everyone, because of course it's not. But I do think within that uniqueness, there are similarities and there are things that we can learn. And when often people say to me now, could things have been different for you? And actually, I think they could. I think there are things people could have told me earlier on in the process that would have made me certainly feel less alone, that might have been helpful at the time. So that's what I like to offer now. So let me tell you what happened. So even though I've now told this story lots of times, I've written a book, I've done countless events, hundreds of events, this bit, the bit where I have to say what happens, still gives me a stomach churn every time. I'm sure it's something a lot of you will understand, because it's that moment that bereaved people feel when someone asks you, have you got any brothers or sisters? How many children have you got? And you have to decide in that moment what you're going to say and how honest you're going to be. And I always have this in this moment, as I hover on the edge of actually saying it as well. I think I'm still slightly struggling with not wanting it to be true. Sometimes I think I wrote a book to force myself to keep saying it, so that eventually I would have to accept that it was true and it had happened. So let me tell you what happened. So I'll show you my book cover, because on it you can see that's me. Hopefully you can see that I'm real. It really is me. I think I look quite the same. And this is my brother Mattie. I think we're about 8 or 9 there. I was a year older than him. By the time he was knocked over, I was he was 13 months younger than me, and by the time of the accident he was 9 inches taller than me. And I adored him. He was cheeky, funny, very clever, very vibrant. He did always seem very much alive. And then we lived in Yorkshire. We lived in the pub our parents owned. And then one night he's knocked over from a car on the way home from a pool hall where they had discos. And that night, he was taken in an ambulance to Pontefract Hospital. And I was there shortly after he was knocked over. He...
Come down. Winnie, move.
I think maybe someone's unmuted. I'll carry on.
Mute yourself, please, if you're mute.
I'll carry on anyway. Yeah, so he was knocked over by a car. I'd been in the same place. We were in the same place together, but I'd taken a lift from a friend earlier on. And then I was asleep. Well, I was just going off to sleep in my bedroom at the back of the pub. And there was this commotion in the car park. And quite often people did come and make commotions in the car park, because as anyone who's ever been in a pub knows, you know, you get drunk people and then they leave their car keys or their wives or their jackets in the pub and they come and they knock you up. So it didn't seem sinister to me. And I opened my window and there was a man in the car park and he said, "Does Matthew Minturn live here?" which is my brother's name. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You'd better come then, he's in trouble." And I was a very bossy older sister, and I very much believed in my own capacity to be able to sort things out for my younger brother, who I adored, but did also quite enjoy patronizing. And I sort of slightly used to protect him a little bit from our parents, because he was a bit naughty. So I'd protect him when he got in trouble. And the way that phrase sounded, "he's in trouble," didn't make me feel it was that much of a big deal. So I didn't wake my mum and dad up. I just went downstairs and got in his car. Then in his car, he told me he's been knocked over. The driver didn't stop. We've called an ambulance. And then I got there and I knelt next to him in the road. The ambulance came and I got in the ambulance. And it was really when the ambulance men arrived that I realized that it was serious, because although he was unconscious, somehow in my life, I was quite, you know, because we had sports teams at the pub, football teams. I mean, they were always getting knocked out. And then a couple of hours later, they'd be sort of sitting up at the bar with a bruise over their eyes or whatever. It just didn't even occur to me how serious it could be. And by the demeanor of the ambulance men, I realized it was. It was 1990, a long time ago. And I think that, I think in a way everyone was more naive in 1990. Of course, I was 17. But when people started saying things like head injury and brain surgery, I just really had no concept of anything other than the very binary proposition that he would live or die. And of course, I wanted him to live. At Pontefract, I had to phone my parents and tell my parents about it. And I still remember that moment. And again, one of those old-fashioned dial phones. I remember pausing my finger in the last digit, thinking that as soon as I took that off and the call connected, that it would become more true, as I had to tell my mum about it. What happened next was Mattie didn't die, but nor did he actually ever get better. So he was operated on that night, and afterwards the neurosurgeon came to see us and he said to my dad, "I've saved your son's life, but we don't know yet whether or not that was the right thing to do." Of course, at the time, we unquestionably thought it was the right thing to do. All we cared about was that Mattie would live. And we entered into this new life with great hope that if we loved him enough, we would be able to help him. You know, I used to make him mixtapes and dance around by his bed. Very, very gradually and painfully. And I'm not going to labor this in talking to you, because I think it's a very specific thing. But I feel I'm not going to go on about it too much. But very gradually and painfully, we realized that actually not only was he never going to get better, but that it would have been better for him if he had actually died on the night. Many years later, I see that what happened to Mattie is a very modern thing. If his accident had happened 10 years ago, I've been told, he just would have died there on the road. There wouldn't have been the technology to keep him alive. But we have reached this point now where we can keep people alive, whether or not they're, you know, even if they don't really have any meaningful life outside of a beating heart. The epigraph of my book is from a neurosurgeon called Henry Marsh, who wrote a book called Do No Harm. And he says in that, emergency brain surgery is very simple. It involves drilling holes in the skull and draining out blood, and is well within the competence of most junior doctors. The question of whether to operate to try to save the patient's life, however, is much more difficult. So Mattie eventually died after 8 years. And the thing I thought was, because those 8 years had been so awful, I did feel I had already grieved. I wasn't expecting really to grieve more after he died. I wanted him to die in that strange way that I didn't really want him to die. I wanted him to be better. I wanted it to have never have happened. But given the situation as it was, I did feel it'd be better for him to die. And I was very shocked by the utter avalanche of grief I experienced when he did die. Because I kind of thought I'd done it. I honestly thought I'd cried enough. I thought I thought there must be some finite amount to the crying I could do. I don't actually think that anymore. I don't think there is a finite amount to the crying, and I don't think there's a finite amount to the pain of some things. And it's that bit now where I really feel that some different support could have made quite a lot of difference to me. Because what I did was I sort of thought that there was something wrong with me, that I was so upset, and everybody wanted me to move on. I do remember my dad, as we would go, because I had a boyfriend then called John, who had proposed to me, and my dad really loved John. He adored him. And I remember my dad, as we got in the car after the funeral, my dad said, thank God that's over, and now we can get on with planning your wedding, which I think is almost sort of funny now. I think he just desperately wanted something good to happen. But of course, it was quite a pressure. And again, at that time, I didn't realize the extent to which I would fall into a bit of an error of trying to make up, trying to compensate to my parents, trying to be everything to them, which I still struggle with a bit, but I've got much better at realizing I can't be everything to them. So I did get married, and I tried to have fun, and I tried not to show that there was anything wrong with me. And then I entered a period of trying not to talk about it. There was this one particular night when I just follow a pattern of pretending to be okay, then I would get quite drunk, and then I would just go on about it for hours and hours and hours, crying. And I remember one night suddenly realizing that this was what I did. And I resolved then I wasn't going to talk about it. I wasn't going to talk about it anymore. And I decided that. And I did keep that up for a few years. And things did get a bit better. At one point, I thought I wouldn't be able to have a child because I thought I could just never risk feeling like this again. I thought, my grief for Mattie is so huge, and he's my brother. How could I cope with having a child who might die? And I thought I was destined not to have a child. But then my first marriage sort of collapsed under the weight of all this grief that I didn't really understand. But I did meet someone else, my person I'm married to now, Erwin, who's a nice, tall, shy Dutchman. And we did decide to have a child. And I think that having my son, Matt, and I called him after my brother, which wasn't my intention, but it just suddenly seemed the right thing to do. I do think that was a catalyst for me feeling that I wanted to try to make sense of what had happened. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I tried several times to write about what happened to Mattie, and I gave up because it was just too upsetting, it was too distressing, or I lost my way in it, I couldn't see how to do it, or I tried to turn it into a novel and couldn't make that work either. And then when my son was 2-ish or 3-ish, he was sitting in the supermarket trolley, and I never talked about Mattie, but I had one picture in my wallet, which was him and me when we were children, and I had plaits and he sort of had his fingers curled around my plait. So I had this picture in my wallet, and I was paying for the groceries, and my son, Matt, saw this picture and he pointed at it and he said, "Who's that?" In that sort of child way, "Who's that?" And I just thought, I thought, I'm not going to be able to make stuff up for him. I'm going to have an answer for him. I'm going to have to think about what I say. And I think it was partly that made me think, actually, I'm going to have another try at writing it down. And then I managed to do that. And I think the reason that I managed to do that when I'd failed before was partly because I thought that if I knew this time that there was really no giving up, that it wasn't that, yes, I could stop and put it back in the drawer, but I'd only be back at the drawer again in a year's time, in a few months' time, in 2 years' time. So I had this really strong sense that I had to write it out of me. I didn't at the time think that anyone would read it. That wasn't really my plan. I just wanted to write it out of me. But as I wrote it, I showed it to a couple of friends and they encouraged me. And it did become clear that it might be a book. And the effect of writing the book was amazing, because I did really change how I felt about what had happened, or I felt I understood it more. I understood myself more. And I said to someone at one point that, you know, the 8 years between Mattie being knocked over and him dying, I said that I felt I would rather not have been alive in that time. And I do think one of the things I got by writing the book was I rescued that time for myself, really. I accepted that those 8 years existed. I accepted that they made me, that it was part of who I was. And also I came to see that I had a role over those 8 years, that I was a sister. One of the things I think that's very difficult in grief is the way that it does remake language. Because I loved being a sister, and I'm not a sister anymore. And that made me very sad. But writing the book did make me feel, I plumbed some depths. People often ask me, should I write my story? And I, you know, on balance, as a writer, I do think people's lives are improved by writing, and I do think there's a cathartic benefit to it. But equally, it's a hard thing to do. It took a lot of effort and commitment and will. But then the most magical thing happened, and I hadn't expected this at all. Also, I mean, I never thought anyone would read it. I just thought it was too gloomy. I thought what happened was so awful. I didn't think anyone would want to read it. But actually, as it turned out, people not only read it, but they find it really hopeful. Though I never want anyone to stop. I always feel if people are going to read it, I want them to read the whole thing. So I think if you stopped in the middle, it would feel quite miserable. Whereas I think that by the end, again, even if it's just the merit that we do all survive, the rest of the family survives the horrible thing that happens to Mattie. But people did read it, and they found it beautiful, and they found it life affirming, and people started to talk back to me. So I felt that I had taken this subject about which I had been silent for years, and then I'd written about it as honestly and as openly as I could. And then my reward for that was that people talked back to me. And I felt that to be such a huge honor. And also, I really felt I had found my tribe in a way, because I hadn't ever really contacted any. In the earlier days, I hadn't been involved with any support groups, and hadn't really known how to, hadn't even really known how to do that, or hadn't thought about it. And then as soon as people started getting in touch with me, I felt I really did feel less alone. So again, but mainly what people were saying to me is, thank you for reading your book. It makes me feel less alone. But the effect of them saying that to me was that then I felt less alone, because they were telling me that they felt less alone. This sort of virtuous circle of reciprocity was born. And it felt really magnificent. What people asked me a lot was, and I still remember the first time it happened, because I was in Scotland, and a woman said to me, my sister's son is in the army. I get moved by my own story still sometimes, but I'm more moved by other people's stories in a way. But I remember this moment so vividly. So this is 5 years ago now. And she said, my sister's son is in the army and he's just been killed. He was blown up by a mine. Do you think I can give her your book? And I had no idea. I had no idea what to say. And then people would keep asking me that. They would tell me about a tragedy that happened to someone, and they would say, can I give her your book? And what they were asking me was, will your book make them feel better? Or is your book so sad that it will make them feel worse? And I never really came up with an answer for it, because I think that sometimes, I think that the funny thing in a way about something terrible, something truly awful happening to you, is that actually you're probably less able to be upset by something bad happening to someone else. But equally, you might not want to read something else sad. I think sometimes you might just want to get in the bath with a box of Turkish Delight and read an old favorite, or, you know, watch a rom-com on telly or something. So I never knew what to say. But what it started me thinking about was, I thought, could I write something where there is no sad story in it? There's just the helpful stuff. And then eventually, I then did write a manual for heartache. And what that was it was a response really to all the people that had written to me. And it was also everything I'd learned, because I did learn a lot by writing my book, but I felt what I really learned was from the response of people to my book. And then the conversations I had as I did events and traveled around the country and met people in the signing queue. And they all told me interesting things. And that really, it just grew my understanding of how I thought about grief. And some of the things I really wanted to share were that I came across this notion of content and process, and it was a therapist who told me about this. Content being what's happened to us, are individual stories. I have the story of what happened, that I had a brother and he died, and you all have your individual stories, and those are our unique stories, unique to us. But process being the way in which we can try to accommodate that into our lives. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because that means that it's sort of, to a certain extent, our content is important to us, but actually the process, what helps, is something that can be shared. And the process might be different for everyone. So like the most simple level, you know, running's good for some people and not for others, and reading books is good for some people and not for others. But I was interested in splitting it in two like that, and I wanted to share my process and the process that other people had told me about that had turned out to be helpful to them. The thing that I felt was very unhelpful, that I was told after my brother died, and I just wanted to kind of get out to as many people as possible, you don't have to think about it like this, was people kept saying to me, time will heal. And people kept saying to me, it will take a year. Loads of people said to me, it will take a year. And that's why so my brother died in July, and I organized my wedding for the following September, because I thought I'd be okay by then. And instead I sobbed as I walked down the aisle. I was in no fit state to be getting married. But this thing of it will take a year had sunk in. And that was when I started feeling defective. I thought there was something wrong with me, that it hadn't taken, it took a year. And I think the whole nature of time, and of course, people are only ever trying to be helpful. That was another thing I wanted to explore. Quite often people say things that are terrible, really, but equally, it's not, I've never wanted to get involved in feeling bitter about the silly things people say, because they're only doing their best, aren't they? It's sort of tricky. I did want to provide a little list of things not to say, which I think people enjoy, often being, try not to get into a squabble about the funeral, because I often, people again often write to me and say things like, as though this wasn't bad enough, then, my mother-in-law complained because she wasn't in the car at the whatever. So I think that's a fairly safe one to try to suspend, just massive benefit of the doubt to everyone, and accept it's a hard time for everyone. And I always felt although in general, I often very much like religious people and I enjoy talking to people about faith, I never enjoyed being on the receiving end of anything like God wouldn't give you more than you can handle, or he's gone to a better place, or anything like that. And I just did feel it was safer, unless you know the person might be comforted with that. I think it's safer to leave that sort of thing out of it. And what I think is really important is to not, I wanted to write about how it feels. I'd sort of rather cope with someone being clumsy and a bit rubbish than someone who would cross the road. So my dad remembers how, he'd be in our village and he would see people cross the road because they didn't want to have to talk to him about Mattie. So I think really when it comes down to it, there's just a very powerful thing about presence and how we stay in each other's presence, and how we witness for each other, how we bear witness to the terrible things that can happen. The other thing I wanted to explore was I got into Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, and one of the things I did find very helpful was just that idea of, don't ask why me, you know, you might as well ask why not me. And certainly that did help me a bit, because I think sometimes we sort of have this idea that if we're a good person and if we do our side of the bargain, then somehow we don't deserve it. But I mean, all of that is just, it's sort of almost irrelevant. It's not, or certainly for me, it's not a helpful way to think, really. And I wanted to write about how what I'd really learned was that there's no reset button with grief. So this whole idea that time heals, it is true that in time, you know, that you won't always feel like this. I think that would be a helpful thing to be told. It won't always feel this acute. But I think I struggled a lot with thinking that I would feel better, thinking I would feel back to normal. And what I now know is I was never getting back to normal, never getting back to how I was before. And I think that's true with a lot of things. Well, I think it's true with the things we're discussing tonight, that you're not going to be restored to how you were before. And I have reached the point now where I'm even able to think, like, would I want to be? Finally, I can completely accept, not, again, I've realized that acceptance isn't about, I'm happy that happened, but it's just more about just accepting the reality of it. It did happen. And to try to accept that the life that I have to live. And that's why I think when I was choosing a title for this, I called it Grenades and Guillotines, because what I realized talking to other people was that when you have something like this, it is like a grenade explodes, and yes, it takes someone out, but what it does is it shrapnels everyone else around. And then you become the walking wounded. So it's not only that you're the bereaved, it's that you are the walking wounded, and you have to work out how to try to look after yourself. But the guillotine bit is because I think the most helpful way for me to think about it is when I was at school, we had it was called a guillotine. It was a machine that chopped paper. And it was very exciting. You know, as a child, I loved it because the kids weren't allowed to use it. Only the teacher used it. So there was always a sense of ceremony. And this blade would come down and it would separate the two pieces of paper. And I thought, actually, that's what the grenade does. It separates life. It separates the old life from the new life. And what I really felt I wanted to say to myself, reaching back through time, was I wouldn't try to fool her, the young girl that I was. I wouldn't say, like, it's okay, it doesn't matter. But what I would say to her is, there is a life for you out there. It's not the life you were expecting, and it's not the life you wanted, but it is there, and you can move into it, and you will find meaning and purpose, and there will be things for you. And I promise you that in your future, you are glad to be alive. And that's what I wanted to say to her. And it feels like tough love in a way. That's still what I feel. I'm never ever saying to anyone, can't say to anyone, like, oh, don't worry, you'll feel better in a bit, because it's just so completely not true. What I always want to say to people is, this is truly terrible, but there is life for you. There's life in the future, and you'll find meaning and purpose, and you'll find a way to be of value. And that's what I've come to see. And that's what it is. And that's certainly how I've managed to make meaning and purpose. And one of the things I really hated, people used to say to me, like, oh, everything happens for a reason. I just think that's a very bad thing to say to someone whose heart's just been ripped out. But it's not that I believe that, but I do think there's a trick by which you can look at the mangled wreckage of your life, and from that you can craft meaning and purpose. And that would be the way round that I would look at it. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I hope people might ask me some questions. And yes, it has been an honour to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Cathy, for sharing your story and your journey. It's so real, like your books. They're just so real, so honest, and so moving. And yeah, I just want to thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Got some lovely comments on the chat, which I'll read out. Jane Harris says, never the life we wanted, but we will find purpose. Yes, as you say, grief is always unique, so true. Rules simply do not help. And thanks for talking so eloquently about siblings, so often referred to as the forgotten mourners. I always remember my daughter saying to me, Mum, people always ask how you are, but they never ask how I am. So let's pay attention to the voices of those unheard siblings and ask them how they are. Thanks so much, Kathy. And there is no finite, you will always be Matt's sister.
That's lovely, thank you.
That's very nice, very moved. Thank you, Kathy, that was incredible. That's from my daughter.
Oh, how lovely.
Very moving, thank you, Kathy. Thank you from Claire, thank you so much, very honest. Yours was the first book I read after Annalise died, A Manual for Heartache, and I found it inspiring and it gave me hope.
Oh, I'm very honoured, Claire, thank you.
Charlotte says, Kathy, do you think you need a certain amount of time after the death before you're able to write about it without impacting your mental state?
I think that's a really interesting question, Charlotte. I think, so to answer that as a writer first, I think there's definitely something that I call this composting. So if something, I do try now to write morning pages, I try to write about what happens to me, but I don't try to do capital W writing about what happens to me. I've had some fairly hefty stuff, as I'm sure we all have, over the last few months. I haven't tried to turn it into beautifully articulated prose. I've just written in my own diary about what's happened. I might in the future write about some of those things, I don't know. I think life kind of has to come first, but I think it's helpful to write down what you notice and what you see. And again, if I could travel through time to my younger self, I would tell her to write it all down, because I would also say, you think you'll remember, but you won't, you'll forget. And I think, because one of the things I learned is that specifically in a time of trauma, memory goes haywire. So I think it is good for you if you can make a record for yourself. It always gets very muddy when you start thinking about other people and sharing it and publishing it, because then you get into judgment. So I think that's a slightly different thing. And in terms of it impacting your mental health, again, I think to have somewhere where you can honestly communicate with yourself is really important. Because again, even like in a family situation, often people are feeling different, like even in supportive, loving families, often people may be, for example, moving at a slightly different rate. Often if you're in a couple, you might see things about it at a different time. And I think if you possibly can, you want to hold that space with compassion, but it can really help to have somewhere else in which you just have an outpouring that's only for you. So that's what I think about that.
Thank you. Claire asks, I'd like to ask you about anger. How do you cope with your anger?
Well, I used to get very drunk, which isn't very sensible. I don't drink alcohol anymore, and I haven't for about 3 years. And I must say I'm a very happy, sober person now. I don't mean that everybody has to stop, but there's a lot of alcoholism anyway in the Irish side of my family, and a lot of mental health and alcohol problems in that side of the family. And I just felt it was time to stop, and I feel very pleased that I did. I still think I've got an ongoing problem with anger, actually. I don't feel I'm finished. I don't feel I'm done. I'd say my residual issues are about being hypervigilant with my son and how to stop ruining all of our lives, because I endlessly, like a cat on a hot tin roof around him. And also anger, because what I'm really good at pretending that I don't feel anger. I allow myself to be sad, as you'll see. I've been very moved by this evening, and I don't mind like letting my lip wobble. But if someone had made me angry, I promise you would not know. So I'm really good at hiding it. Again, I learned it in the pub and all the years with Mattie and what have you. I've got a real poker face when it comes to anger, but then I repress it and don't deal with it very well. So yes, I'm afraid I don't feel I've got anything to offer about anger. Well, I could offer my friend Julia Samuel, who's a brilliant writer, her book Grief Works, I'd highly recommend. She has me like punching a cushion and swearing a lot, actually. Punching the cushion, saying the rude words, and she does kickboxing. So And yes, she does recommend, you know, so I go running now, which kind of pounding the pavement sort of helps a bit. But yeah, I used to think I just genuinely wasn't an angry person, whereas I'm not a vengeful person. I don't, often people, you know, because of course my brother was knocked over by someone. People often want me to be angry with that person. And I'm just not. But I mean, possibly that's an excessive empathy. I just know how awful I would feel if I'd done that to someone. So I'd imagine it's not very nice, you know, so I don't feel, I'm not a vengeful person, but I do tend to bottle up my anger.
Thank you, Kathleen. There's a question here from Rebecca, she's a fellow bereaved sibling. She just wanted your input on how you cope with being the forgotten mourner, as we siblings often are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. And again, the comment earlier on about people ask how you are, but nobody asks how I am. I mean, that really was my experience. It is difficult. Again, I think that thing of finding whatever it is, whether it's journaling, whether it's talking to a friend. I mean, therapy, if you can get it, I think is wonderful. Just being able to be honest about your experience and knowing that it is. I think the sibling thing is quite specific, and people are often hidden. One of the things when I wrote my book was a really quite large amount of people got in touch with me who I already knew. You know, I knew them professionally, but I didn't, we'd been enjoying each other's company for years without knowing that we were bereaved siblings. And then of course it strengthened that relationship, but it really made me see how so often as a bereaved sibling, you get on with it, you're a good little trooper, you don't want to be difficult for your parents, you work out how to kind of, you know, smile your head off or whatever. And you just, you get used to that. You get used to sort of hiding it. So I would say repressing in the long run, I don't think is good for anyone. So just about finding some space where you can be you, I think. And I do feel I have eventually thought, you know, realized I don't have to be everything for my parents, and they don't want me to either. It's a burden I've kind of somehow taken on myself. But it's very difficult, isn't it? That being an accidental only child, being a sudden onset only child. I think it's really difficult. And you've known a different life, I think. One of the ways I talk about in the book is I felt that, you know, my family used to function like a car with 4 wheels. And then suddenly one of the wheels was gone and we were just scraping along the road. So, and I think is the balance of it as well. It's not like this in all families, of course. And one of the things, a lawyer wrote to me actually to say he was recommending the book to his clients in, I can't remember, I think he used something like catastrophic cases. But he said it was very nice to see that my parents had managed to stay married, because he said it's just so difficult. So I think it's really difficult. I remember one of the people who I didn't realize was also a bereaved sibling was the mothers of one of my son's friends. And this always makes me cry, so I'll just apologize now. She said that her sister, I think she was 15 and her sister was 17, was knocked over by a lorry. And she said she was upstairs and she could hear her mother crying in the kitchen. And she said, I'd never heard my mother make that sound before. So again, it's that thing of the bereavement, but you're also navigating very changed parents. It's a big deal. And again, we just need to love each other, I think, and find support possibly from each other or however you can.
I think there's a question related to that. Do you have any specific things which parents can do to help their children who are the siblings of their child who died? Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, well, my mum always says actually that if anybody ever asks, because sometimes my parents come to events with me and people ask her questions, and she says that, this is going to make me cry as well. She says that the thing she would always say to people is look to your surviving children. Just look to your surviving children, because it's very easy to not see them and to not realize they need you. But I actually think, like many things, it's just rather than individual things, it's just like completely turning the volume up on compassion for everyone, including yourselves. You know, I absolutely don't want, it would make me feel very sad if any bereaved parents out there are now telling themselves off or feeling nervous about how you are with your remaining children, because I think it's just about knowing that, again, we're in this situation that nobody wanted and nobody and everybody's struggling with. So I think just as much compassion as you can muster for everybody, including yourself, is probably the most important thing. And yeah, and just whatever you can do to. I mean, one of the really useful things my mum did do for me was that she got me a really good therapist, and the fact that she did it meant that I felt good that she organised it for me, and she was quite assertive. But she was like, "I think you need to do this, and I think you should do this, and I want to organise this for you," and that did feel very important, because often I was pretending to be okay for them. I think that's the thing. But I find being a mother really hard when I haven't just lost a child and I'm only dealing with my one child. So I can only, I'm in awe of anybody dealing in that situation. So just want to send lots of love, really.
It's quite hard to be compassionate with yourself when sometimes you don't feel like you deserve it as a bereaved parent.
Yeah.
Because of some of the guilt. And it's quite a hard thing to do.
Yeah, we do, don't we? And I think the thing is, everybody knows it's not logical. I still feel, I was talking to a friend in my garden who I adore, and I don't see her very often. She knew us both when we were little, and we were talking about it. And she said, how, she's a therapist. She was interested in how it is for me now. And again, out of nowhere, even though I feel quite, I feel quite okay about it now, honest. But out of nowhere, I just started crying. I said, I still think it's my fault. I still feel I didn't keep him safe. And I think that, again, that's a specific older sibling thing. When I've got some very good friends who have 2 girls. And I noticed every time the mother walks out of the room, she says to the oldest girl, she says, Alice, look after your little sister. And every time she does it, I think, that's it. I was just really used to looking after him. I went to save him and I couldn't save him. And again, I'm sure that's magnified as a parent, because again, you feel that's your biological destiny. I think, I don't want to speculate, but I think about it a lot, obviously too much. I think about how it would be. So yes, I do think that the guilt and but it's the most important thing to access compassion to yourself. And I think possibly if you could think of it, that it will it will help your remaining child if you can find compassion for yourself. It's not helping anyone, actually. That kind of punishing and self-blaming, it's not good for you as an individual, but it's also not good for the people around you. You can try and loosen it off a bit.
Thank you. Are you happy to take a few more questions?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I know it probably looks like I'm having a wonderful time, because to be honestly with people and discuss these things is so profound. I think
Yes.
I'm at your service.
Wonderful. We're really happy that you're here. And so Ruth asks, how does Mattie's death manifest itself in your present life, day to day, being an only child now? I think you said something about that, about your anxiety.
Yeah. Well, I think as my parents get a little bit older, they're still quite young, but my dad's not in brilliant health. So the thing is that I've always known I will feel this. I'm sort of anticipating feeling very lonely, because then I'll feel there's only me left, and I'll feel I'll be, whatever happens with my parents, he won't be there to help me. So there's that. And also it's the bigger thing, although that made me feel very sad then, I haven't said that out loud before, so it made me feel very sad in the moment. The bigger day-to-day thing is this hypervigilance around my son. Especially actually as he gets older, because he's 11 now. And I think I probably need some more therapy about this, because as he's gone to big school now, he doesn't look like my brother particularly, but he's starting to remind me of him more. And it feels really different. I wasn't too bad in terms of the hypervigilance. I wasn't too bad when he was little. But now I feel really nervous. And I'd imagine the danger is I only increasingly feel anxious as he goes up to the age Mattie was when the accident happened, and have this sort of like slightly bonkers sense of foreboding. So those I think are the things. In terms of my feelings about my loss, I do feel quite reconciled. And I have actually, again, another way that Julia Samuel helped me to think was, she said to me, the relationship with the person doesn't have to end with their death. You can still have a relationship with Mattie. And I do feel that now. And I do talk to him, and I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know if that is, I don't know whether I was this sort of thing, like, if it is really you, please don't go away because I really love it. Or whether he's in my imagination. I don't really think that matters. I have a relationship with him, which is very joyous, and I feel very pleased about that. So it's more in that navigating the world thing without him. That's a very interesting question. Thank you.
That is a favourite saying of mine, actually. Death is the end of a life, not the end of a relationship.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you, continue. You said you talked to Mattie. Is there other ways that you continue your bond with him or your relationship with him?
So where I live now is just not far from the graveyard where my grandparents are buried, and then we put a plaque on their grave for Mattie. We scattered his ashes at sea finally many years later and put a plaque on their grave. And I run by there. Also, I honestly didn't really know this. It wasn't, because when we did that, I was still living in London with no intention of moving to Cornwall. And I think probably it's not a coincidence that we did that. And then I moved about 10-minute walk away from the plaque. So I run by there, and sometimes I have a sit, but more often I kind of like give him a cheery wave. I do talk to him, and he does sort of pop up. He often gives me career advice almost. And he's very, I don't know whether I should swear in front of all you people. I don't want to offend anyone, but he's very outspoken. He will kind of just pop into, I'll be getting fretted if, I'll be feeling fretful about something, and he'll say, what the fuck are you worrying about that for? It's very, very helpful. Again, I don't know whether I've just internalized some version of him, but he's very helpful. He's always urging me to live a better life. Well, not a better life, that's wrong. To live a bigger life. And he's always urging me to care less about everything. If he had his way, I'd be, I don't know what, I wouldn't be responsible at all. I'd be kicking up larks all over the town. He's very much wanting me to, I feel he's sort of keeping an eye on me, I can sort of slightly feel him now. He quite often, recently said to me, why are you always nagging that nice husband of yours? He's a nice bloke. There's nothing wrong with him. Either leave him or be a bit fucking nicer to him. And it was wonderful. It was just, and he was just absolutely right. It was spot on, And yeah, I can imagine him now, what he'd say to me about being hypervigilant about Matt. He'd just say, leave the poor kid alone, let him make his own mistakes. Yeah, it's true, so that's the sort of way he does pop up and say things into my head, and I like it, and it's actually always very good advice. So yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's not happened like this before, that he's popped up with people, but that feels very nice. I do feel that he was just here then, but again, I don't know what that means. I don't have a belief system for it, but I don't worry about it. I just feel glad that, yeah, we're a powerful bunch, says someone. Yes, you are. Yeah. I just noticed there, actually, somebody said one of the first things my daughter said after her brother died was, I'll never be an auntie. And that's true as well. Part of my nervousness about Matt is I feel, again, the whole reason I think in a way that he is an only child is because I just couldn't bear giving him a sibling who then might die. I couldn't bear setting that up. And also I feel very sad. In my head, I feel everything would be okay if only Mattie and his hordes of wonderful kids lived around the corner and we all hung out together, rather than being this sort of lonely trio. But again, some of this is all just, I don't know what it is. It's all in the head, and it's back to that thing of, I do try to spend a lot less time these days not moping and pining for what I can't have, but appreciating what I have got, and just giving myself a little bit of a talking to about, but it's not bottling it up, isn't it? So as it happens, I'm saying it all to you tonight, and then maybe tomorrow when I'm doing my morning pages, I'll write a bit about it. As I was talking to the lovely people at Compassionate Friends last night, I realized I still have this deep sadness probably reanimated by Dad's recent ill health, that I will one day be alone. And you see, already it's less sort of like up in my emotions, and it's more like, yes, I can accept that. Yes, that's how it is. And then I'll be able to kind of like get on with other things, rather than being sort of, trapped in it, I think.
Gosh, there's lots and lots of questions here. Lots of questions about how to support surviving children, which I think you've talked a little bit about. Do you want to say anything else about that, about how we can, as parents, support those?
I guess just give them space as much as you can, give them what they need. I mean, it's ever so sad, isn't it? Andrea says, I feel guilty for crying over my brother in front of my mum and dad and setting them off crying. I mean, yes, that's how we feel, isn't it? I still feel, actually someone earlier on asked about how my parents are. My dad's so proud of my career and my book, of course, because he couldn't read and write himself until he was an adult. So I promise you, there's nothing that makes an illiterate man prouder than having a very literate daughter. For him, me being on Radio 4 is much better than if I was in the Olympics or something. So he's very proud of the book, but he's still really, really sad. He's still really sad about what happened about Mattie. And I think, as lots of people do, he got on at the time. He coped. We needed to. I didn't really realize this at the time. Again, I think my parents protected me from it. But we'd only just bought this pub. We owned a load of money on it. He basically, they'd put their life savings into it, borrowed loads of money, and then a few months later, Mattie was knocked over. So, and they were worried about money at that time, which I didn't realize. They obviously kept that away. But again, they managed to do that, and the pub worked, and so I think he just slightly sort of, just repressed it all. And I think that, I think it's still a very big thing for him. And then, of course, I do sometimes worry that I haven't done him any good, but then I also think I don't think that is the right way to think, because I think he's also very proud of it. And actually, my parents both love that it exists. They love that the books exist. And quite often when I get emails and letters from a parent type people, I'll pass them on. And my parents find that very sort of reinforcing. Again, they like the fact that they're being useful to other people. But they live quite a quiet life now, and I think that's all they want. They're not interested in. They have a very, very small social circle. As they said, the effect of they like getting out in nature, so they didn't like lockdown when they weren't allowed out. But they don't mind they're very happy if they see, me and my husband and my son and a couple of other people. They don't. I think it's because of all that. I just think all the trauma and stress is still sort of in them a bit, particularly my dad. I think my mum grieved in a more straightforward way, in that she's not very good at pretending, whereas my dad and I are really good at pretending. And of course, it's a great coping strategy, but it does seem to set you up with problems in the longer run, I think. Whereas my mum, I remember the day of my brother's funeral, my mum just went to bed. She said, I just can't be with these people. Whereas my dad, I just can't be with people. Whereas my dad and I ran the wake, gave everybody a good time. So I think but again, we're all very different people, aren't we? Even in families, we respond differently to things. I'm always trying to get my dad to have therapy, but he's really resistant to it. But I think it would really help. But again, I just sort of accept that that's sort of, he's his own person. But I'm very pro therapy and pro having space to talk about it. Whereas I think my dad still worries that if he starts talking about it, he won't stop. I think he's very wary of opening the floodgates.
There's a question from Jane actually about do you think you'd be a very different person without the therapy that you've gone through?
Oh, without the therapy, yeah. I do think that what's helped me is to have had supporting, loving parents who were not perfect by any means. So again, as my mum would be the first to say, that nobody should beat themselves up about any of their failings, but they did care for me and did their best for me. And then I would say the therapy, pretty essential really, and several chunks over the years. And as I said, probably need a little bit more now. Matt's getting a bit older, and what tends to happen is I have some therapy, it's going very well, I stop, I get signed off, and at that point I always think, oh brilliant, I'm sort of fixed now, it's all going to be okay, and then I let a crisis develop before checking back in. Whereas actually probably tonight has helped me see that I really need to discuss this, Matt going to big school and me becoming very hyper vigilant because he's now wearing a blazer and a tie, and it's reminding me of Mattie and his friends. So yeah, I probably need to go and check back in. So I think I'd be a very different person without the therapy, and probably not very well, I'd say. And of course, I'd be a very different person if it never happened. But I've stopped worrying about that, which I do think is I'll never stop worrying about it in the one sense, but I used to spend an awful lot of time moping about what I would be like if it had never happened, and what life would be like if it had never happened. And I do that much less now, just because I know that it's just not that useful. It's just not that helpful. It is better for me to focus. I didn't always think this. I genuinely think now what happened to him is a terrible shame, but I'm really glad I had a brother for 16 years. I do now really think that. Didn't always. I really think that now. And again, can even see, yes, it's a shame for my son that he doesn't have him, but you know what? I tell him stories about him, which he loves. So again, he can live a bit for him as well. And that's what I think. Another word on the therapy, actually, because the other thing I had, and actually I had this after my book came out, because someone who read my book, who was a therapist, said, you should try this. I did have Mdr Therapy, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a trauma therapy. But if people who are listening, of course, not all bereavement is, I never quite know how to say this. Certainly for me, what that did was I used to have a lot of flashbacks and a lot of panic attacks, and I would flash back to kind of like horrible scenes in the hospital with him having huge epileptic fits and stuff. It was so awful. But the EMDR did really help with that. So I no longer have flashbacks, and I no longer have, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, whereas so the EMDR really helped for that. So I would recommend it if people are in, because that's the thing. We will always feel sad. It's not like we'll never be able to fix it. But if you actually have PTSD, then there are things that can practically help. And actually that might also be if for people worrying about their children, their surviving children as well. If they've done sort of traumatic witnessing in any way, that might be something to think about. And I did know someone who was someone I met who'd had so, and again, he was older than me, but the accident had happened, I think he was about 12, and his younger sister was knocked over with him, and he was fine. He felt very bad about that. And then 30, 40 years later or something, he had some, and it did help him. Doesn't help everyone, of course, but that's what I found.
And there's a question here, Kathy, about reforming as a family after such a trauma. How did that happen? How did you manage to keep together as a family? And I'd like to ask, what you think, how your parents managed to stay together, really, because you mentioned that what was it that they did?
I think they probably saw it as I think they've just always been the good team. And I think they just decided to see it as, they somehow saw it as another thing that they were going to cope with together. As hard as it was. So yeah, I mean, they're not like anyone else I've ever met. They met when they were quite young, and they're everything to each other. There's a saying, the children of lovers are orphans. And whilst I'm obviously very glad and happy to have very good parents who are very keen on each other, the other thing that I felt was my brother and I, the family was in balance when my brother was here, because he felt like he was my person. And then, so sometimes after that, I definitely felt like, you know, they were in the front seat of the car and I was in the back seat of my own, was sort of on my own, which was what sometimes it felt like. So yeah, so I mean, it's just, I think it's just very hard. I think I said it earlier on. I think giving people the benefit of the doubt, which is not something, it's not a very modern value. I think everybody should do more of it, actually, because it does seem a modern way that we're just now allowed to easily take offense at people. I'm not apologizing, you know, I'm not being an apologist for anything, but I think when times are difficult, I think to be able to give people the benefit of the doubt, to be able to resist the temptation to self-righteously fly off the handle, just to keep kind of like coming back to, this is hard for everybody, but let's try to be loving in this moment. Let's try to not make things worse. That's what I used to think sometimes. Let's just try to pause. Press pause, I think, is a good one. Let's just try to press pause and just not, you know, let's just press pause and just be calm and just, you know, and I think just lowering your expectations of everyone, including yourself, and just trying to be loving, but not try to, this is quite specific because some people might be cheered up by doing stuff, not try to do big things, I would almost say. Like a bereaved friend of mine tried to go on a big Christmas holiday. They tried to go on a big holiday as a family to cheer themselves up, and of course it was awful because everyone was miserable, and they weren't less miserable because they were in the fancy place without the lost loved one. They were more miserable because they were away from home, and it made them more aware of the absence of the person. But obviously that was a well-intentioned idea, but you know, you need to do a bit of wound licking sometimes. You know, you need to retreat, you need to hibernate. You need to be able to say, you know what, I just need to go to bed for the rest of the day, or and to hopefully be able to slightly take it in turns. I think that's what my parents feel they've done. They slightly took it in turns to be the strong one. You know, there were times when one of them had to kind of take the helm because the other one was struggling, and that's what they tried to do. They tried to swap in and out, you know, but it is just really, it's just really hard. But sometimes you do also find, I mean, one of the things I definitely would say I've got from it is, in general, I'm not a very petty person, because I just genuinely, I don't care about very much at all, other than that everyone's alive. That really is kind of the only, and that people are nice. I don't like people being mean to people, but I don't, and I will say it, you know, I didn't, you know, I crawled over glass to survive what happened to my brother. I didn't do that so I can get wound up about petty crap in daily life. That's not what it was for me. So I think sometimes there is a thing where that awareness of how precious and fragile life is, I think, does mean sometimes that you can kind of see the bigger picture about what matters. And you know, so there can be that, I suppose. I think it's certainly what, I think that's usually what's kept. I mean, my parents and I don't I mean, in some ways, I suppose we never want to offend each other, but that means we don't. We're very close, and all we're ever grateful for is that each other are alive. That's the only thing I care about. We just don't have differences of opinion, because we're just grateful we're all still here. We're what we've got left, and we know how precious that is.
It's a sort of gratefulness that you talk about in the Manual for Heartache, that sort of being grateful for each other. And
yeah, and of course gratefulness can be difficult when you feel miserable and angry, but it is, what I worked out was it is a neurological thing. I'm bad at explaining stuff about science, but it's because the brain is kind of set up to look for risk and look for things to be frightened of. Whereas if you write down a list of 10 things you're grateful for, which can include, you know, a clean water supply, having air to breathe, it doesn't have to be big. The brain will just start looking for good stuff rather than dwelling in the bad things. So it does really work. In fact, I probably need to do that. I'll do that tomorrow as well. Chewing myself up into anguish over my son, I'll write down the grateful list, and it will be stuff like, you know, I can see there are still green leaves on the branch outside my window, and I'm very one thing I really notice, people when they write to me, having read my book, they say things like, if only I'd known how happy we were. And that's the thing, and that is really hard. It's really difficult to be grateful for the absence of a tragedy. But what I've sort of learned is to not let to enjoy the trivial banalities of daily life. And funnily enough, at the end of my new book, Dear Reader, which is about books, I mean, it is nice to write a book that doesn't have to come with a health warning, it's not incredibly sad. But at the end of it, I wrote about how grateful I was just for the fact that I go running, and then I go to my parents, and my dad makes me a grapefruit. And the bit I missed out about that, just because it seemed too trivial to put in a book, was that so it was a Sunday morning thing. I did it all through the winter. Again, very good for my mental health to be outside, but I don't really want to be outside. I want to be inside reading a book. So I would use them as bait, that I would go on this run, and then my dad would make me a grapefruit. And then they used to take me to the supermarket, and we'd do the shopping together. Then we'd bring it home, and my dad would like prepare my garlic for the week and stuff. And it was just a really nice time. Anyway, I didn't put that bit in the book because it seemed a bit too, I don't know, normal, domestic. But of course, I'm so glad that I did feel grateful for that, because a couple of months after I read that, we couldn't do any of that anymore. There was no supermarket. There was no running to my parents. There was no having breakfast with my parents. There was no my dad chopping up my garlic in my kitchen. And I did think, well, I'm really glad I appreciated that while I had it. There is a bit of that. And again, the trick is not to think, oh, I wish I had appreciated what I'd had. It's about what you can find and how you can find. And I mean, that is the thing with time. I think the more time goes on, it's not that I've never been so sure. I don't think it's so much that you mend a broken heart. It's that you can grow the other bits of your heart, I think, so that the damaged bit can become less all-encompassing. That you can become bigger, I think, is what I think about over the time. So it's not that the wound heals necessarily, but that you've got more heart in other ways.
And that's actually one of the ways that you end a manual to heartache, isn't it? About, it's not about avoiding, or it's not about the broken heart, it's about loving, an expansion of the love.
Yeah, and what I've been thinking of a lot lately, and again, this might seem like tough love, so I'm not suggesting this to anyone else, but it has been helpful for me, is just really thinking, and probably the younger you are, the more difficult this is to see as well, but I feel like ease into it a bit as I get older. It's really thinking that actually life is a journey from innocence to experience, isn't it? And again, whilst all these things that have happened to us are terrible, well, the thing I say in my hardest days in recent time, what I've said to myself going to bed is, I've said to myself, whoosh, I've said, I learned a lot about being a human being today. And there's something really transformative about looking at it that way. Again, it's the opposite of like, why me? What have I done to deserve that? I've had enough heartache and suffering in my life. I don't deserve any more. But just to be able to just hold the space, be useful, and then think, right, I learned a lot about being human today, just makes me feel different. And I think I think that's what people are feeling at the moment. In the space of about 2 days, I spoke to, well, including me, 4 friends, all dealing with a very difficult, big life event. And I think that's how it is. I think that's how it is at the moment, isn't it? Very hard stuff.
Well, Kathy, on that note, I think we need to draw the evening to a close. But before we do, just thank you for sharing your story and your journey, the content and the process with us in such a real, such a moving and such an honest way. It's just been a wonderful evening. Such a lot of sharing between us as well in the chat and so on, which is just wonderful. It's what peer support is all about. So I'm really hoping that some of Kathy's unique perspectives and the reflections of her own loss resonates with you, and that you found something, all of you have found something in her words to take away. Well, I know you have from the chat, and build upon as you try to manage and cope with your own tragedy. As the dust jacket of a manual for heartache states, I hope that Kathy's time with you has, quote, shone a chink of light into a dark day and has reminded you that you are not alone. A little reminder, a little plug here that Kathy's book, A Manual for Heartache, is available to purchase on the TCF website under shop, and any proceeds from these sales go to support our charity. And once again, Kathy, just simply a huge thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight and to answer questions and comments. And I will share with you afterwards all the chats.
Oh, that would be lovely, because I'm seeing all the lovely things and all the
lovely... I'll copy them and share them for you. So
appreciated, everyone. Thank you. I'll tell you what I'm going to go and do now, in case it's useful. The last practical tip. When I feel moved like this, I'll go and get in the bath with a cup of tea, and I will have a lovely cleansing cry for me and for my brother and for you and for all the lost loved ones, and I will feel better. You know, I'll feel moved, and that we've had this beautiful thing of being with each other as honest human beings tonight.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. And I just want, before everyone leaves to go and have their own cup of tea or their own bar of chocolate or whatever their thing is, mine's a big bar of Cadbury's chocolate, that's what I do. But I just want to let you know about our next speaker in the series of talks, and it will be bereaved mum, blogger and author of Living in the Morning Light, and her name is Andrea Corrie. You can join Andrea online on Wednesday, the 11th of November at 7 p.m. again. And she's going to be speaking about her own journey after the death of her son, James, her grief toolbox, what she calls her toolbox, and how she found glimpses of what she calls the morning light. And you can book for that on our website under online events. I also just wanted to mention a wonderful event that's coming up. It's not a Compassionate Friends event, but it's called the Good Grief Festival. It's running online between the 30th of October and the 1st of November, and it's 3 days of free events with people like Carrie Lloyd, who does the Griefcast podcasts, Julia Samuels, who friend of Kathy, who Kathy mentioned, and the comedian Robert Webb is also talking. And there's loads of workshops, lots of interesting talks. For instance, Am I Grieving Right? The Healing Power of Nature in Grief, how to support someone who's bereaved, and workshops on writing and the literature of loss. So lots and lots of, I think over 45 talks and 100 speakers. So it's a wonderful event. So you can Google it at Good Grief Festival, and it is free to attend. So finally, a warm and just a heartfelt thank you to Kathy and to all of you actually for being here with the Compassionate Friends tonight. And I just hope very much that in times to come, you're surrounded by understanding support from within and outside of our charity. Remember that you're not alone. We've got our helpline, our online support groups, our one-to-one support, our wonderful library, postal library, and many other services for you to connect with other bereaved parents and siblings. So please keep in touch with us and let us share together. Stay safe and well, and a very good night to you all. Thank you for coming.